Welcome to the Touch MBA Admissions Podcast. Do you need help figuring out which schools to apply to or how to get into the world's top MBA programs? Hey, you're not alone. Join thousands of others on this podcast and on our site, touchmba.com, as they seek the admissions edge. And now, here's your host, Darren Joe.
Welcome to the Touch MBA podcast. This is your host, Darren. This week, I have a really special and interesting guest on the show. He's my good friend, Andrew, who just graduated from the MIT Sloan School of Management. Andrew and I actually met back in 2007 when we studied Mandarin Chinese together in Taipei, Taiwan. So Andrew and I go way back, and it's been great to see him progress throughout his career. After studying Chinese in Taipei, Andrew worked for Tractus Asia in Shanghai. He also worked for Target as a senior analyst, doing business intelligence and analytics before attending the Sloan School. What I'd like to focus on today is something different than what we've talked about in past episodes. First, I'd like to focus more on the career journey of an MBA student and then alumni. How does that whole internship and job search process work? And then I'd also like to talk to Andrew a bit more about the social life, the social side of top MBA programs, because let's face it, it's a big part of MBA programs. And previously, we've really focused on admissions and how to get in. But in this episode, I wanted to mix things up a bit. So Andrew, welcome to the show and congratulations on graduating from MIT Sloan.
Thanks so much, Darren, and thanks for that generous introduction.
My first question, Andrew, is let's just take our listeners back on your journey. Why did you apply and enroll in MIT?
Sure. As you mentioned, I was at Target immediately before business school, and I looked around at people at Target who had climbed the ladder and made it quite high in the organization, and the vast majority of those people had MBAs. So that was sort of one indicator for me that made me think maybe I should consider doing this. Next, I studied history as an undergrad and Chinese, as you mentioned. And so when I looked into the curriculum at the top business schools, there were so many things that I really didn't know that much about. So that was really exciting for me, and I thought the coursework would be quite useful. And then last of all, you alluded to the fact that I was married during business school, and my wife actually went to Sloan as well. She's pretty smart, so I figured if she was doing it, I should probably follow suit.
Three very good reasons. And we'll get into that social aspect of it in a bit. But first, let's talk about how you went about finding your internship. I know you ended up interning for Uniqlo.
Oh
gosh, I was just about to ask you, am I saying that correctly? Uniqlo.
Yeah.
Uniqlo, which...
So it's kind of a contraction of unique clothing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I've been calling it Uniqlo for all these years incorrectly, but I've bought a lot of shirts from Uniqlo.
They'll take your money no matter how you pronounce it.
Exactly. So you were an MBA intern for them in New York City. So could you walk us through that process? When does the internship search start? How does that process work at MIT Sloan? And then how did you secure this internship?
My impression is that the internship recruiting process at all of the schools works more or less the same. I guess I don't know that for a fact, but that's the impression I got. And at Sloan, it starts very early, particularly the biggest recruiting industries like finance and consulting start extremely early. I would say within a month of school starting, maybe even 2 weeks, there are mixers that the big consulting firms and the big financial institutions put on. And then that's almost continuous, I would say, through the first semester, and then they interview during January. We have all of January off for recruiting. The banks may even be earlier, like December, but the consulting firms are in January, and then that is all decided. So if you're looking at financial and consulting, you know whether you got a position at one of the firms that you wanted by the end of January. And then after that, the sort of big Fortune 500 companies show up on campus, and the big tech firms. Tech is big at MIT, and I guess big everywhere, given that it's such a successful part of the economy now. That all starts more like mid to late January. Uniqlo is a huge company. I think it's the 5th biggest apparel retailer in the world. It has many MBAs working there, I think primarily though in Japan, and they had never formally had an MBA internship program until the summer I was there. So they recruited at 4 or 5 schools, and ended up that me and a woman in my section were actually the 2 MBA interns. I think I interviewed with Uniqlo in February and had 2 interviews and got along really well with both the interviewers. And one of them was a Sloan alum, one of them was a Stern alum. I don't recall whether I had another final round interview because the hiring manager was one of those 2 people I just mentioned. So I think I was looking at some other options, and they didn't have a clear deadline when they were going to tell me, if I remember correctly. And then I got an offer from a startup and let them know, and then they gave me an offer within a couple days. And that was in March, I believe. So sorry, that was kind of quite a long monologue, but that's how it went for me.
So, I mean, were they one of the companies that came on campus to recruit? How did you find out that they're even looking for new MBA interns for the first time?
Oh, good question. Yes. So there's what's called on-campus recruiting, which is done through the CDO, the Career Development Office. So that's just sort of the official channel by which employers can recruit Sloan first-year students. So Uniqlo did recruit through that path. So there's a website, that we all have access to where all the job postings are for full-time and for internships. And I just saw that Uniqlo was looking for somebody, and they were pretty flexible in terms of function. It wasn't like we want a person to do this exact thing. It was more like we're looking for MBA interns to work on a range of projects. And you talked a bit in my introduction about how we studied Chinese together. And back when I lived in Shanghai, I loved Uniqlo and often visited the one on Huaihai Lu. So I was pretty excited when I heard they were recruiting, and I'd actually visited their store in New York as well. So having been in retail before Sloan, I wasn't 100% set on staying in retail, but it's just something I like. So when a company that I like in an industry that I like made it known that they were coming to campus to recruit, I just submitted an application. And I think they chose maybe 10 or 20 people to interview and took it from there.
Yeah, I saw a stat on the Sloan website that like about 75% of jobs are sourced through schools' facilitated activities. So it sounds like you were one of those, at least in terms of internships. How important was your past experience in terms of landing that internship? Because I think a lot of listeners probably might want to try out an industry or function that they don't have experience in. Sure. For their internship.
And that's certainly a common desire among MBA students. What I will say sort of to that point is, well, first I'll talk about myself and then give a general thought on that. My own experience was definitely important. The specific work experiences that I had at Target, and then I had actually done sort of a pre-MBA internship at an ad agency in San Francisco and worked with some big beer brands and done interesting digital work for them. And
so we should probably clarify, like, what were you responsible for at Uniqlo? Uniqlo.
Yes. No worries. I worked for the head of finance and business development. So I did 2 things. One was the sort of original ask, and that was a forecasting project, which ties with what I'm going to be doing at Apple, which we can talk about later. So they had, the head of finance wanted a better sort of data-driven forecasting model to predict weekly revenues. So that was what they were looking for. And then because he was also the head of business development, another project came up that was pretty cool. So I asked if I could help out, and I ended up helping them collaborate with a startup that does sensor technology. It's essentially fancy and more sophisticated counters. So we did sort of a test pilot at 4 or 5 stores, and then we validated the data, and then we pitched to the executive team sort of a rollout of this program to all of the stores in the United States. So that was the two things. One was the forecasting, and the other was this business development project. So you were asking how my prior work helped me in securing the internship. I guess I wouldn't say I had a specific prior experience. Like, I hadn't done forecasting per se, but I had worked with data a lot. So at Target, you mentioned that I was in business intelligence. So I was working with all of Target's transactional data. So I was comfortable pulling data and creating tables and arranging it and all that. And then I think just the range of experiences that I had, I also worked for an investment firm doing fixed income investing after my time in China. And the hiring manager really liked the breadth of things that I had done.
Got it. Okay. And then do you feel like that generally held true for most of your classmates at MIT?
I guess what I'd say is there are certain industries, certain companies that essentially don't care what you did before you work for them. And it's not that it doesn't matter. Like, you generally need to have certain types of skills or certain types of experiences, but it doesn't matter if you got, say, leadership skills by, working serving in the military, working in a school, leading a nonprofit, like whatever. If a consulting firm wants strong leaders, then they come from all sorts of places. But then there are other industries or companies that really hire based on specific skills or specific job-related experiences. So I guess I would just say to the career switcher, know whether it's possible. And know whether the school that you're looking at has a history of helping people transition from your current industry or function to your future, like, intended industry or function. The one place where I see at Sloan that people have a challenge is they, for whatever reason, are enamored with private equity or venture capital, and they have no finance experience. It's pretty much impossible to go from something outside of banking to private equity, or something outside of finance or having run your own startup very successfully to getting a VC job. But the more common jobs, like going to business school and then going into consulting, going to business school, then into finance, pretty much anything goes.
Got it. No, that's really good inside experience for our listeners. And you bring up some great points there. So now, in actually a couple days, you'll be heading to the Bay Area to work for Apple, which is, one of the hottest companies to work for. So how did you land that job? How did that work?
Sure. Well, as you're probably aware, Apple is a bit secretive, so I'm not going to disclose too much. But I will say that Apple came to campus and recruited through the official career development office channel. And to sort of cut directly to the chase, I was offered and accepted a position in operations that I'm really excited about.
That sounds super top secret, man.
It is.
Wow. Well, congratulations. I mean, I'm sure that Apple is a really hot company. Did you have a lot of your classmates, were they also applying to Apple? And what other tech companies were recruiting at Sloan?
I don't know exactly how many from my class will end up at Apple. I do know from looking at the CDO's report that there were 10 from the class of 2014, 10 Sloanies who ended up at Apple. But other big tech employers, I think in 2014, Apple was the number 5 hirer of Sloanies, and I believe that Amazon was number 3. So that they hire a ton of Sloanies. Other big tech firms, Microsoft hires a lot of people. Those are the 3 big ones that come to mind. I know a few people get hired at places like Facebook. Oh, I forgot Google. Yeah, they're in the top 5 or 6 hirers of Sloanies as well.
Do you think those companies come to MIT Sloan because of its engineering reputation? Or, why? I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that's That's probably a part of it. I think generally Sloan has a reputation of being analytically rigorous, and that is in some part based on its connection to the greater MIT community. And I think another driver of that is that Sloan has a higher proportion of engineers, people who majored in engineering as undergraduates, than probably any of the other top programs. It's I believe more than a third of Sloanies majored in engineering. So I think companies know that when they're hiring Sloanies, there's a good chance that they will have an engineering background and then the business background to pair with it. So there's that aspect of it. And then I also think that once you have a critical mass of alumni at any given company, whether it's the big tech firms, the consulting firms, or the financial institutions, they tend to return to their alma maters to recruit, which then creates this feedback loop that deepens the relationship between the companies and the MBA programs.
Wow, that's really great. So do the employees from companies like Apple and Amazon and the consulting firms, do they tend to also be MIT Sloanies?
I think generally companies sort of outreach to business schools using alumni from those schools. So whether it's Sloan alumni that have been at alums that have been at a given company for 4 or 5 years that go back and they help out with the recruiting. Maybe it's the initial round interviews. Maybe it's selecting a pool of candidates to participate in the initial round interviews. And then they even have really early graduates who come back and help sort of try to drum up interest in the companies. So, for example, some of the consulting firms even use students from your own class. So if you interned at one of those firms over the summer and you get an offer, some of the firms will give those second-year students a budget to take out students in their class and try to build interest in the firm.
Wow. That's great. That must be quite funny as well.
Yeah. I'm not sure it's put to good use, but I am sure that it's used.
In terms of the availability, are you sending your resume out to 4 companies, 8 companies, 12 companies? I mean, how hectic is it? Do a lot of students apply to 20 companies? I mean, give us a sense of scale and of the process.
Sure. It varies a lot. Some people come to school knowing I want to work at one of the big consulting firms, and then they're very targeted about that, and they during their first year, go to all these recruiting events for those firms and work the relationships, and then they try as hard as they can to get that internship, and then if it goes all right over the summer, then they get the job offer, and it's pretty much set. So some people are pretty narrow, and then some people don't really know what they're looking for, and they apply all over the place. I was pretty focused, and I think some constraint is helpful. So whether it's a location-based constraint or an industry constraint or a functional constraint, having some constraint will help you narrow down all the options, because there really are a ton of options. And there's the original sort of big recruiting industries, the consulting, finance, the Fortune 500. But then once those are done, there's all these other companies that keep posting jobs. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that comes up after the sort of the main push. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, and I think there's a big range in how people sort of take advantage of that opportunity.
I mean, it just shows like kind of the wealth of opportunities you get at a place like MIT Sloan, in terms of companies coming to you. And then one other question I had in terms of looking for internships and jobs is the role of alumni. I mean, you mentioned that a lot of your classmates knew about different teams at Apple, but did you speak to alumni, or did alumni play a role in the recruiting process?
I would say I was helped by alumni at both the location of my summer internship and then full-time job. There was a Sloanie sort of on the recruiting team for Uniqlo, and there were plenty of Sloanies at Apple. And they were all at both places helpful and gave us some tips on how to prepare and that kind of thing. So alumni were definitely helpful. I'm excited to be out there with so many Sloanies, and not just at Apple, but I've heard that there are 50 or 60 people from my class going to the Bay Area.
Dang. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's, I think more than 10%. I think the class is about 400. It's a huge draw. So it'll be great to have so many classmates out there.
At least in the class of 2014, a fifth of the class ended up going to San Francisco.
Really?
Yeah, and then 33% out west.
Yeah, my numbers got to be way low.
No, I mean maybe it's different. Maybe it's different your year, but either way, there's just a ton. It sounds like a ton of Sloanies out there. Any last sort of insights you could share with our listeners about, preparing for and succeeding with their career plans, during the MBA program?
One sort of high level takeaway that I had is we just talked about all the Sloanies heading to the West Coast, and that's certainly true. And I think that will continue to be true as long as tech is big. But I would consider, for someone looking into business school, if you know where you want to live, I would focus my business school search in that vicinity. Just because even with all the Sloanies out there, it's just that your network is naturally going to be the strongest wherever your school is based. Despite the huge number of Sloanies out in the Bay Area, there's more here in Boston. So if you want to be out in the Bay Area, there are obviously great programs out there. If you want to be in New England, there's great programs here. Or if you want to be in the Midwest, there's great programs there too. I wouldn't worry so much about the rankings as I would about going to the best place that you can in the location where you want to be.
Awesome. That's a really interesting insight. And I actually wish more applicants would think about that. But just because rankings are, it's the easiest way to get started. A lot of people, just end up using those. But that's a great point. Let's now talk about the social life of the MBA program. And for you coming in, you were already married to a Sloanie who was 1 year above you. I guess my first question in terms of social life is, what is the trajectory of what takes place the first year versus the second year? Is it similar? Is it different?
Good question. The first year, everyone's trying to get to know everybody. And because you have, at Sloan, we're broken up into oceans. At other places, it's, cohort or section or whatever. But we have our classes with the same roughly 70 students for the first semester. So everyone is trying to get to know each other within the ocean, and there's the school plans events to help people get to know one another, and then the students within the oceans also plan events for themselves. And then there's sort of the cross-pollination of people getting to know each other in different oceans, and I mean, it's all just pretty natural.
I'm sorry, it just sounds funny. So, do you guys call each other Pacific or Indian or Atlantic?
Yeah, and you even guessed right. I was a Pacific. So we have chants that go from the tame to the extremely bawdy. And, I guess we're supposed to have identities. I don't know. Some people and some oceans take their ocean pride a bit more seriously than others.
So first year, everyone's trying to get to know each other. I imagine that first semester, there's a lot of different social events.
Yeah, a lot of socializing, a lot of career stuff though. People are also, particularly the people who are going for the finance or consulting, want to get on track for that immediately. And it starts so soon. So I think they actually get to know each other really well because they end up going to all the same events. So there's some bonding that happens there as well. And then there's prep for the interviews, which is a whole nother thing, but is a way that people get to know each other.
And then in second year, or second semester of first year, people are starting to take their electives. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is there a big difference between the first and second year in terms of the social life? Or is it pretty much the same?
In my experience, there wasn't a huge difference. The only difference would be in the second year, you have a group of friends that you already know well, and maybe that group is still expanding, but not at the rate that it was during the first year.
What were your favorite social aspects of MIT Sloan?
So Sloan has what are called C functions, which are Thursday night parties held at a building on campus. And it's like free beer and usually free food. And they're put on by a different cultural group. So it may be like the Korean students order a bunch of Korean food and they do a sort of a cultural performance. And then after that, they're like people go out to a bar or a club. So that's every Thursday. That's one of the main sort of school-sponsored social activities. And then the other thing that I should mention is there's tons of travel. And, you know, some of that is to exotic locations over breaks. But a lot of it is also going hiking in New Hampshire or something over the weekend, or going to somebody's parents' house in Maine. Activities like that were really fun for me and were a great way to get to know people outside of the academic context or even the C function context. I did one hiking trip. I did a couple sort of cabin stays, a couple trips to New York just to get to a big city for a short amount of time. And then I did one of the sort of study trips. I got to know people really well on those trips. If I could give advice to myself a couple of years ago, I would say travel more, study less.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a way to bond. I mean, that's how we met, right? Abroad. And I'm sure if it was, an intense 1 or 2 week trip, you can really get to know people better. Did you feel like there were any challenges that you faced as a married candidate? I mean, I guess your wife was there, so maybe it made the experience even stronger because there's two of you going there, or not?
I don't think so. The average age, I believe, is 28. So it's a bit older than some of the other programs. And I think for that reason, there's probably a higher proportion of married students. I do think I probably spent more time with other married students because we were married and because it made sense to go to brunch with our classmate and her husband or something like that.
Did you have any expectations, and this doesn't matter if this is as a married person or unmarried person, but in terms of your expectations of the social life that you would have at MIT, I'm wondering how those expectations met up with reality. Were there things that surprised you that you didn't expect?
Not really. Maybe that's just because my wife was a year ahead of me. So I heard about the social scene from her, and maybe that's why my expectations were pretty much confirmed by the experience I had. I guess maybe the one surprise in that regard was the second year wasn't any easier than the first year. I mean, a lot of people had jobs. They finished their summer internship, got job offers, and then you, in theory, could totally coast. Of course, there were people who did, but I would say by and large, people worked pretty hard both years, and that meant that the social life wasn't that different the second year from the first.
Interesting. Who were your favorite classmates at MIT Sloan? What types of people?
It's fun to go to school with your friends. And I did get along with so many people really well. But if you're looking more for a type, I found that sort of the type of classmate who would ask the question that many people might be thinking, but many people might also not have the guts to ask. I always liked having class for that person. Or the person, I mean, this sort of cuts both ways, but sort of the person who really gets argumentative. If they disagree, they just will take a stand until the last punch. But those situations were relatively rare. I guess I just liked it when people would get into serious debates in class.
Yeah, no, I asked that question because, a lot of our listeners, they'll be interviewing with students and alumni. It's just interesting to hear what people who have been through the experience, what they're looking for, who they liked as classmates. Any last things you could share with our audience about what to expect in terms of social life at a top business school? Of course, different schools will be different, but in terms of MIT.
I think it's sort of, my thought in that regard is related to what I said about location. So you can, through Touch MBA, through all of the online resources, through talking with current students and alums, like you should be able to get a decent sense of the character of a program or the students in a program. And obviously it ranges anywhere and there's diversity anywhere, but certain schools have reputations for whatever, for more partying or less partying, for more of an academic focus or less. There are all those different measures upon which you can evaluate the schools. And I think there's a lot of information out there, and there's really no excuse for making a bad decision or for getting into a program that you really don't gel with the people. So I would just say know what you're looking for, and if you're married and you want to have more married people to hang out with, then, look at the numbers. You'll be able to identify those schools that would fit you better. Or if you're 22 and want to go wild, then I'd say go to Manhattan and go wild. Or if you love California and, want to live in the Bay after, then there are great schools there. So I think it's just doing research and then also reflecting on your own so that you know what you want. And if you know clearly what you want, I think that also makes you a more attractive candidate to the schools, because you can credibly say, I'm this way, your students, your program are like this, there's a good match, I'd love to go to school X.
So as our one data point on this podcast in terms of the MIT Sloan culture, how would you characterize it?
An intense laid back. Can those words be put together? It's like, there's a lot that you can learn. And the classes, if you choose the intense classes, if you choose the classes that will stretch you, it can be a lot of work. Or, you can do things that you're already better at or that are less intense, and it can be easier. So people in the same class can have very different experience based on their own skills, how much effort they're putting in. But I would say when the bell rings, almost everyone is friendly and is happy to sort of continue the discussion on whatever topic was under discussion in the class. And I will say there is one class, a case-based class, that generated a lot of discussion, and we had it before lunch, and me and all my friends would have lunch and just keep discussing the class for another hour afterward. So I think it's that genuine interest in learning that is common, but it's not ultra competitive type of atmosphere.
Andrew, thanks so much for joining the show, and I can't wait to catch up in person as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show. It's been great telling you about my experience.
Thanks for listening to the Touch MBA podcast. Don't be shy. We have a mailing list. Go to touchmba.com and get yourself signed up. And we'll keep you posted with the best tips and insider interviews on how to get into your number one school. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook at Touch MBA. See you soon.